All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another installment of To Catch a Fraudster. We are very excited for today's session. We are going to be covering trends to watch in 2024. And I will be your host today, Tyler Adams from CertifID. And some of the topics that we're going to be covering include fraud, risk and trust, fraud detection versus cybersecurity, and then going on the offensive. And one thing that we're really excited about is that while we go through some of the material today, we're going to be ending by providing a kind of a deep look into some of the data that we got from our most recent State of Wire Fraud report that we put out annually. So if you haven't seen it yet, this will be sort of a sneak peek of some of those details, and then we'll be sharing with you an opportunity to go ahead and download it and be able to get all of the goodness that comes from our annual report by the end of today. But before we get started, I want to introduce our speaker, good friend of mine and partner in crime. I guess I shouldn't say partner in crime, partner in security, Max Kirchoff. He is the VP of product here at CertifID. He comes with an incredibly rich history of working in all different types of businesses in the technology space. Some highlights: Google, Brightside Health, the Zebra. We actually get to work close together here in Austin every single day. And so I'm really excited about this opportunity for you all to get to meet him and learn a little bit more about him and his experiences and how they impact what we build at CertifID. I think it'll be really neat for you all to get to sort of see how his mind works and some of the things that he's done in his career and how that's led to the development of our products here. But yeah, I'm really excited about this. I don't know if I've had another guest on To Catch a Fraudster that I know this well and that I get to speak to daily. So hopefully we keep it on the rails in terms of what the webinar is supposed to be about today. But who knows when the two of us get going. So Max, welcome. Thank you for being our guest today, and really excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Love being here. Love being able to address everybody. And I think just share a peek into the conversations that Tyler and I and other folks here at CertifID have on a pretty regular basis around what we do and the industry itself and how we build better trust.
Awesome. Well, let's fire off some questions at you. So before we do that, I guess one reminder, if you all have questions, shoot them off into the Q&A. And whether it's on the specific topic or a question for Max, because you have never gotten an opportunity to meet with him as our VP of product, don't hesitate, toss him in there. We'll have some fun and then hopefully grill him a little bit along the way. All right. So the first question, Max, how do we stop fraud and scams?
Yeah, the ultimate question, maybe for a lot of folks when dealing with our software and why you can come to talk to us and pursue just the ability to help stop fraud and prevent it. I really want to back up, though, because I really think the important question here is like, where is the source of fraud and scams? Not the individuals, but like, what is this in self and the relationships that we have with our customers and with other individuals out in the market? And it really comes back to trust. The way that frauds and scam work normally is they're exploiting trust. So we have relationships with our customers and they have relationships with their real estate agents and other individuals in our industry. Those relationships, there's just implicit trust there, right? We're all humans. We utilize trust on a daily basis just to navigate the world and get through our lives and be able to continue on and be happy, right? The problem is that there are individuals who exploit that. So it's this unquestioned part of our own relationships and our own business dealings sometimes where we trust too much, maybe, or we trust enough and people exploit that. And that's really at the source of fraud and scams and how trust operates. So I want to use an example. There's a good analogy to another industry, right? I worked at Google for a while. I did not work in security at Google. I worked in another division at Google, but I was well aware of a problem they had because almost everyone in the company was. And I guess I would ask you, Tyler, any ideas what one of the biggest security problems for someone like Google is, this massive tech company?
My guess for Google would be just probably what a lot of even like the big companies face now, like phishing. You have so many, individuals that you have to worry about clicking on a wrong link or, making a mistake.
Yeah, absolutely. Phishing, business email compromise, the standard stuff. There's also something that uniquely affects larger businesses or even medium-sized businesses that we take for granted. Maybe if you work in a small office like ours where we know everybody. At Google, and the New York office I work, there's about 8,000 people. You can't know all 8,000 people. You show up in the morning at 9 a.m., you go to get on an elevator, you swipe your badge to get through a door, and there's two people behind you, and you're like, well, I'm a nice person. I'm going to hold the door for them. And you let them in. Do they work there? So there's this implicit trust, right? Just like anywhere we go to Starbucks, we want to hold the door for people. We want to let people in behind us. We have this trust. We want to be seen as like good people. We want to hold the door for folks. This is a big problem for somebody like Google because now there's a security vulnerability there, right? Someone could come in and be able to gain network access or steal something or find information that's super important. And that's how like trust exploitation works, right? Just as an analogy, in our industry, you all see this, like that's how it works here too, is you get bad actors in the mix who are exploiting our relationships or what we believe to be true about the folks we're dealing with. I think there's another sort of section in the slide after this one, where really when we think about trust, right, it's a fundamental element of real estate deals. So I'm like kind of a geek about stuff. And I really had not worked in title specifically, but I had done some work with real estate before and real estate tech. But for this TCAF, I think it was a little bit ago, I started doing some research on like, well, where title insurance companies come from? They appeared somewhere at some point. And it turns out it was in Philadelphia in 1868. There was a court ruling because they had these attorneys who basically would clear titles or lien holders and things. And they just they weren't acting sufficiently to like create great security in that interaction. And this ruling from a court created this need for title insurance. And in 1876, the first title insurance company was founded. And it wasn't founded for any other need than to create better speed and security through a real estate deal, which is interesting because that's still the problem we face today, just in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, that is so fascinating because, and not only different ways, now there's just like so many other ways to exploit it. And I think the Google example is interesting. Like I would have never guessed like physical security was as big of a risk for them, but it makes total sense. Somebody gets in, can get on the network, can get into, something that they otherwise couldn't. But it also speaks to like how brazen anybody who is trying to exploit these things are, that like people are willing to put themselves at risk to go into an office. And like the real estate industry sees that now with people being willing to go and actually try to impersonate someone involved in a transaction. But those of us that do have trust think like, who would ever do this?
Exactly, right. And part of the going on the offensive here, and we can talk about that a little bit more later, like you said, is just thinking critically about this. So the fraudsters, folks who are trying to commit scams or fraud, they're thinking critically about our trust, right? So we need to also. That's the only possible way we can ever actually figure out how do we prevent this at scale. And this is like another slide we prepared that really to just focus on title agents is like, we're the ones providing the trust to transact, or we, the industry. I am not a title agent, but I know what I'm talking to a lot. The folks who work in this area and we provide services for, you're providing the trust to transact to all these different parties. Like you are the company or the individual who sees every part of this transaction, right? And so the nature of how trusted or untrusted certain parts of it should be.
What do you think? Yeah, I mean, what do you think for the folks on the line? Most people are title agents operating in this world, like, establishing trust or doing what they can to establish trust. When we said, the first question was like, how do we eliminate this risk? Like, what do you think? And I know we have more kind of recommendations towards the end, but like, what do you think is actually the hardest part of their job right now when it comes to keeping trust or establishing trust?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I could speak to what's the hardest because I think, that would actually take the individuals themselves to really explain it. I think what we observe or what we see is that they often don't necessarily see themselves as the one responsible for auditing trust and like keeping that in mind, right? When we think about, I should say, what I hear often around fraud prevention, as similar to cybersecurity, is like, well, just give me the tool that stops this from happening entirely, right? Or like, give me the tool that removes the fraud or removes the scams entirely. And I think we're going to talk about that here in a minute. And like, in other words, like, how do we remove the trust from these interactions? it just isn't possible. We're a bunch of humans interacting, people interacting. Trust is there. It's there whether we like it or not. It's about understanding it more deeply and having a really good approach to when to use the trust and when to doubt the trust.
And I mean, I think too, it's about, you have to establish trust in a real estate transaction so quickly with so many parties that have never met before. And I know I've talked about that a lot. Like, how do you do that? And, for each person that's involved, each party that's involved, how do you create that trust becomes so critical. And I think, for the audience, one thing that I think is really interesting about Max's perspective on these things, he mentioned that he, didn't come from this industry, but he comes from a very product-minded practice, and the way in which, we'll get in a room and you'll listen to a lot of you provide feedback about a particular issue or a solution that you'd love to have. And he's so good at pulling us all back out to say, but like, what's the actual problem here? Like, what are we actually trying to fix? And I think that that's really important when we think about, his perspective, because he provides this like great ability to challenge us to think about how we look at these things a little bit differently, where when you are an individual agent or you just want something solved for you specifically, but you can't see that bigger picture, I think that's where his perspective can really help.
I think along those lines, that top line thing you just mentioned is, and this is kind of a techie reference for folks, so sorry, I'm a little bit of a techie, but there's this phrase, right? It's a feature, not a bug. And that's how I feel about trust, right? It's actually a feature, not a bug.
Go one level deeper on that, though, when you think about that. For those of folks who don't know, what like aren't part of technology, understand that.
So I think actually we'll talk about this right here with cybersecurity. And I can better explain this, right? So cool. We go to the question, another way to maybe ask the question on the other side of that statement is like, how do we just get rid of the risk of fraud entirely, right? Is there something we can buy, one solution we have, whatever? And I think of examples in cybersecurity or methodologies. One is this idea of zero trust, right? You'll hear this phrase a lot. People don't actually know what it means. If you're a cybersecurity expert, you understand the nuance here. But someone might hear something like zero trust and they would say, yeah, we just remove the trust from their relationships, right? We just say that there is no trust. At every interaction, at every dealing, at every email, we make every individual authenticate and authorize that they should be a part of this. And I won't drag you into like the details of authentication and authorization, but let's just say at every interaction, I'm going to make you say, prove to me you're Tyler Adams, and that this is your email and this is your phone number, and show me your ID every single time we talk. That's just not tenable in most cases, right? So in terms of cybersecurity, zero trust as a method works in a way. It's just not an entire solution. There's no way you could have an entire real estate deal implement something like this, where every interaction between every individual involved requires that they're constantly proving who they are and that they should be a part of this.
That sounds painful.
Yeah, and as you know, and this goes back to the analogy with like the Google problem, right? To just look at that one for a second. So one way you would say, oh, I know how to solve the Google problem of people getting access, people letting other people in without actually belonging there. We'll put a turnstile at every access point. And you're like, okay, great. There's a lot of access points. There's shared stairwells in that building. There's other scenarios where you just can't put a turnstile there. And so you're going to put a bunch of turnstiles there to try and prohibit this. Maybe you slow it down, but you're not going to totally prevent it, right? Which leads us to sort of the second point here, which is like, you can't have just one method. You've got to have a strategy that has a lot of different layers to it. In cybersecurity, they call this the Swiss cheese model. Our own head of security here, educated our whole company about this, right? And the idea is you need to be able to have multiple layers inside of your security, fraud prevention, and your relationships with your customers and your partners, so that not any one layer is just going to stop everything. You have different layers that create friction or stop stuff, and that's actually more effective. It's a much better way to manage your own security and fraud prevention.
And just for like the audience, like what are a couple examples of like layers kind of that maybe they're already doing or that can just bring this into reality for them?
Yeah, excellent question. So I would assume many folks, I hope anyway, have like virus protection, malware protection software on their company computers. That's great. However, malware protection, antivirus protection, the way it works is it will see known threats, is what it's called. So it uses these things called signatures to match against what malware or virus you might have on your computer. If an attacker or someone has gained access to your network, it won't notice them necessarily as malware or antivirus. So you also need some other sort of risk detection around that. Maybe you have what they call like a canary, where it tricks an attacker to identify themselves on accident, or you have some access controls like zero trust just for your network authentication, right? And that's just in the computer part. You then also, as I hope anyway, a lot of folks, you'll have a callback process. Let's say when somebody's sending you wire information, or you're using CertifID in order to confirm and collect that information. And then even beyond that, you may just be using some of your, soft checks as another layer of just saying like, hey, do we know this real estate agent? Have we worked with them before? Should we trust this person that they have brought into our system now? At a very soft level, that's a layer itself.
Yeah. And that's also too where like things we've talked about, like password managers, right? And utilizing those, or multi-factor authentication. Like each one of these is an individual layer. And I think it's not that each layer has true holes itself, like that can be breached, but it's that just each layer doesn't completely holistically solve the problem or enable to be good trust.
And that honesty is, so when you look at like some of the best players in cybersecurity, let's say like someone like a CrowdStrike, they're very honest about layers and which layers are really good at doing what. And so, they're probably not going to say, oh, there's a big glaring hole in this type of strategy. But what they will say is attackers will have figured out how to get through it in the past or will in the future. And we need to be really honest about that we just need lots of layers. And I mean, you all will probably see this in the fraud prevention stuff we do. 5 years ago, everybody was like, oh, it's all about, wiring information fraud. And then, this last year, especially blew up. It's like vacant lot fraud. Fraudsters have figured it out. They're like, oh, there's tools to help with the wiring information. Let's attack vacant lots now. Let's impersonate sellers. They will move through these systems and find the holes.
You just reminded me. So Max and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and we're always like texting each other a podcast that we find or things we like. But the CEO of CrowdStrike was on one recently, and he was saying how they support a lot of companies that get hit with any kind of ransomware. But he's like really proud of a product that they created. And he said that it's gotten so good at protecting a certain layer that when these criminals get through, and correct me if I'm wrong, Max, but I believe they said that like when the criminals get through and they say, hey, you can pay us this ransomware. And oh, by the way, like you should use this CrowdStrike product to prevent us from being able to come back and do this again. He's like, that's when you really like made your mark, when the criminals are recommending suggestions that involve your software.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You've built the best solution when the folks attacking are even like, this would have stopped us.
Yeah. All right. So how do we effectively prevent fraud in real estate?
Yeah.
I think that's the big question on a lot of people's mind here, and would love to hear from your perspective how you think about it.
Yeah, so maybe folks will have picked up on the nuance of language there. We went from how do we prevent fraud entirely to saying like, well, it's a layered approach. There isn't one strategy, one model, and changing that language, like how do we do it effectively? So how do we just get into the mix? If there isn't any one thing that's going to stop all of it, how do we get into the mix, get into the habit, have a model in which we can build those layers to do it as effectively as possible? And I think there's just a few bullets at like a high level we can talk through. So I think really when we think about effective fraud prevention, especially here at CertifID, we talk about this a lot, as you might imagine, on a daily basis. Really starts with adopting that model that's realistic and layered. So whatever that is, and I don't mean adopting the Swiss cheese model. I mean, inside your own business, saying, okay, we are using the Swiss cheese model, but what are our layers, right? Do we have business email compromise protection? Do we have malware protection? Do we have, if you're a Stewart Title or an FNF, do you have physical security? Like, do you have people badging into the building? I'm pretty sure they do. And then also down to, what are those other processes? Like I said, on the soft side of like, do you have callback processes? Do you have, ways to gauge a relationship with a particular real estate agent or maybe a servicer or a lender? just to make sure that you've mapped that out. You just write it out. The second is having a response plan for every layer. I know that sounds like a lot. This doesn't have to be some, massive document or some massive thing, but to just say at each of those layers, what happens if we believe that there's a problem or a breach or a lack of trust at each layer. So I'll go back to the physical security one, right? It's like, let's say you have to have badging at your front door. Okay, so if somebody gets in or if there's an attack there, like, what do we do then? Well, we ask this person, hey, why are you here? We do that sort of thing. If it's in or malware and antivirus, this one's pretty standard. Most people would understand this. If we detect malware or antivirus in our system, we figure out where it is, we isolate it, we try to get rid of it. If it's in a relationship with a real estate agent, right? If you've never had worked with this real estate agent before, they've brought you a vacant lot deal, you need to have a response plan at that layer. Like, okay, what do we do next? Because this is a low trust situation. The third one, I think, is that just implement defensive security monitoring tools and best practices. I think there's lots of cybersecurity offerings. There's also obviously our offerings. And I think we're even talking more about how do we get into the monitoring and best practices to really help people with that. Because I do think this is the hard part, of how do you constantly manage those relationships and monitor those interactions. But the fourth one that I really wanted to drive with people today is harden that trust and relationships as an offensive. And I'd go back to saying what I said before that I'll explain a little bit more, right? Is trust is a feature, not a bug, which is there are actually high trust situations and relationships in your dealings, and you need to just operate on those as fast as you can when those are high trust situations. So an example there might be, and I'll just use our own product, not trying to make it too much of an advertisement, but when you send a confirm and collect through us and it's certified and insured, that's high trust. That's a high trust situation. You should be able to move quickly on that, right? When you have sent a confirm or collect through us and it's marked as failed, or you've had a couple, you're not sure about this person and you're getting a failed response from us, that's low trust. That's when you want to slow down. And so really treat trust as a feature. So it allows you to move fast, right? And use it as an offensive feature in your relationships. And
I love that. And I know you have more on the trust and relationships that we'll talk through. I just want to go back up to the top for a second. So around the realistic and layered, I mean, in my talking to agents and owners and operators and a lot of people that are on this call, I think, one of the things for a lot of businesses is it can just feel overwhelming in terms of how do we do this? How do we tackle it? And I think, for you all to know, sometimes we feel overwhelmed by it, even as a security business ourselves. And so Max and I and our head of security, we actually, just so you all are aware, we have sort of our own internal roadmap, and we kind of say, okay, what does that prioritization plan look like? Because you can't do it all at once. And so sort of figuring out all right, each quarter, what's one more layer that we could kind of introduce to our team or our people so that you continue to build it up. And I think that's important because that's happening for us as a business specifically, but then it's also happening within our software too. And I think that's what Max was getting at there to say, we have layers even within what you were getting from certified. And I know this is starting to sound like, the 30-layer cake here, but that's kind of how this works and how it's going to help keep everybody safe. But I just wanted to kind of bring that up. But I don't know if you have anything to say to that, Max, because I feel for the folks on the call. They're I didn't know that I was going to have to be a security expert, or I didn't know I was going to have to do all of these things. I just want to run my business. And I think that's why a lot of people do look for hey, give me the one solution that's just going to make this all go away so that I can get back to running the business. And I would just love one more comment from you if you think that there's anything that can help make them feel more comfortable about how they approach this.
Yeah, I mean, for starters, I feel for folks. I ran my own business, and I wanted to just do what we did all the time. The reality was, for me as the sort of main person there, 80%, 90% of my time was doing stuff that wasn't the thing I started the business to do, which is just a reality, right, of running a business. I will say, going back to, that original founding of title insurance, right, that quote I had from, I think it was 1876 from that Philadelphia company. the founding premise was to create better security and speed through real estate. And so like security is just an implicit and foundational aspect of this. And it does seem hard because it's a complex part of what's happening and it doesn't seem like a core aspect, but that really is it. It's like we are the brokers of trust in these relationships, and giving the individuals the ability to make, one of life's best purchases or best exchanges, or if you're on the commercial side, like important investments, being able to just trust those relationships, like that is the thing that we're providing to people in title and on every end, right? As everyone knows, like when you're clearing a title of lien holders, it's the same thing, right? You're trying to provide the trust that they can actually purchase this property and not get caught up in legal cases, as well as in escrow and exchange of money and everything else. I just think that's reframing that is really important, I think, too, right? And the reason I think what's good that you mentioned, Tyler, is like it can just seem very daunting. And that whole realistic and layered is important, is like the reason we want to be realistic and talk about it and just be really honest about it is because if we treat it every stoplight when we're driving through the town like it's a red or a green, we're going to miss an important signal there, which is the yellow lights, right? The yellow lights are the things that tell you to slow down, and then maybe you're going to have to stop, right? And the reason I say that is because there is some nuance in here, which is like not everything is going to be clear cut. And it's important to know if you have a green light or if it's a yellow light or a red light, right? And so like I said, when it's a high trust situation, that's when you should make it so that your organization can just move really fast. And what you're doing is very easy. And then as soon as you see those other signals, the yellow or the red, that's when you know, like, okay, we need to slow down. We need to have a plan here. We need to be really, really realistic here and not just expect everything to work out and be okay.
I think that was very well said. All right. So hardening trust as an offensive. So let's dig into this a little bit more.
Yeah. So we actually had a question from someone in the chat that I'll address because it's a part of this. And they said, they love the idea of removing trust, but how you handle when individuals get annoyed or hurt by constant non-trust. So going back to the Google thing, the real solution that they ended up with there that, was pretty good was that they had a whole campaign called tailgating. And it was said, like, don't be a tailgater. And it was an alligator trying to get in like to a door behind somebody, which is like it's fun for everybody. But it was this great campaign where they promoted the idea that not only should you be asking, who might be your coworkers, hey, like, are you supposed to have access here? Like, can I see your badge? Like, you have to now act as sort of the security at every interaction when someone's kind of walking the building behind you. But that also, as they call it being googly, right? The googly thing to do in that situation is if someone asks you for credentials or to prove that you should be thankful that they're taking the security of the company very seriously and that you should be open to it. Now, it's a little hard, right? Because we're not dealing with employees all the time. We're dealing with relationships. We're dealing with real estate agents and then the individuals that they might be bringing in or businesses that they're bringing in. But I think it speaks to this first point, right? Of like, part of what we have to do is just educate and normalize that trust should be tested and questioned. And I think that does start inside of the businesses, inside of the title businesses themselves, and the employees and the agents who are dealing with real estate agents and brokerages, is just trying to be as education forward as you can to say like, hey, this is important and people are attacking these transactions and we want to protect you. And so we might ask you to authenticate. We might ask you for details. We might want to slow this down. And I know that's hard, but being honest about that is really the best way you can move forward. I think when people get really annoyed is when you don't tell them up front that might happen. It's when you're like, hey, this is going to be fast. It's going to be easy. It's going to be this. And then they are in the Bahamas trying to close their real estate deal. And you're like, yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention. Now we're going to have you fly back to the US to like do this, to do whatever. It's making sure you set up those expectations at the beginning of what a trusted relationship is going to look like.
I think that's so key because I think that I remember, and still to this day, like we'll get consumer feedback from time to time that's like, hey, I just wish someone told me that I was going to have to go through this certified process. Like it was great. Like it worked. It was great. But like I was caught off guard. I didn't know I was going to have to do this. So I think that that's at least an example that we see sometimes. You're absolutely right. Like nobody likes to be surprised. And the education piece can really help. And I think that actually folks could use it more and more as a differentiator. But I like to use the Google example because I actually think that it has to start internally. I think that if you don't do it internally and that becomes part of your culture, that you're comfortable and confident speaking about trust and about how it is going to be established or where you could run into roadblocks, then that gives people the confidence to then start to have that conversation, maybe with the real estate agents that they work with regularly, and then you get confidence there, and then to the consumer where, like, there's a little bit of that like stage gating of growing that muscle as a business.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And like you said, I think also just setting the context that you're doing this for their good, like for their security and to make this work better, and reframing that way. It's kind of like, I don't know if anyone has ever worked on like interpersonal boundaries, but it's actually really similar where you're like, hey, I'm going to have boundaries and they're actually to protect me and they're also to protect you. And it's a hard conversation to have if you have family members who have a hard time with that. Yeah. The second one is, it sounds more techy, and I think there are tech applications to this as well as non-tech applications, which is like just embed monitoring, or the idea of monitoring for looking like to detect changes in trust. And that's like a very techy way of saying part of what we do is when we look at the identity and the traffic and the behavior of how people are using our product, we have signals that we look for. We look to see if certain aspects have changed that we would consider anomalous or strange, right? They get outside of our risk appetite. I'm not going to explain exactly what those are because some of those we protect, but we look for these quite a bit, and we try to monitor the behavior of, let's say, a person or a relationship through time to see if it changes in a way where we need to question that trust. An example that you might be able to apply that's like not a tech example exactly is if you have, I mean, I think you all know this, at least I hope everyone knows this. If you are working with a seller and they're changing their phone number or their email address in the middle of a deal, that's a bad change. That's a change that means you need to question the trust there, right? Because what you believe to be true at the outset of that relationship is now changing while you deal with them. And that should be a yellow light. You should be like, okay, we need to slow down here. And something strange is happening. We need to revalidate that this is the correct information, right? Or if they're adding or taking people away from the deal, which happens. I've bought and sold real estate a number of times myself. You take people out of the deal or add them, my wife was on the mortgage and not on the mortgage. It happens, but you want to make sure to slow down in those moments and see those changes over time. I think the third one is really internally about employees and your own staff. And I think especially if you're in a mid-size or larger business, or actually even smaller businesses, just making sure you're training your team to adapt and act quickly on those signals, like on those yellow lights, those red lights, right? So that if they see a signal that maybe they should question trust, that they're not like, oh, I'll do it like later. I'll do it right before we send the money, or I'll do it right before, whenever, oh, we'll handle it later. And I think that attitude comes from the top. In my mind, Tyler knows this, as like we work in leadership here at Certified, is like, I always believe if you want to affect change and model the behavior you want out of your employees, you got to do that at the top. And so I think like being a owner or a manager or a leader, like to really get your team to adapt and act quickly is to set that model and to incentivize and reward them when they do it correctly, right? So when you have an agent who raises their hand and they're like, hey, this thing happened, I feel like we need to pivot. You're not saying like, no, just make the deal happen. Just push it as hard as you can. You're like, great, thank you for bringing this up. Let's see what we can do. You looked like you had something to say there.
No, I was just thinking of examples too, where we've done it, where like we've, been the first ones to share if we almost fell for a scam or got something, in our email inboxes and thought, oh my gosh, like I almost clicked on this link, and then we'll tell the organization and be like, all right, guys, like I got to admit, like this one almost got me. And I think that kind of humanizes it a lot more amongst the organization. So then people felt a lot more comfortable. We have something where every time somebody joins our business, they get a text message that looks like it's coming from me within like the first 48 hours, welcoming them to the team. Somebody's like tracking our LinkedIn or something. We don't quite figure it out, but we now warn them and then kind of reward as people bring it up in their first week of work, because we just know it's going to happen. So that's been one of us that's worked.
I'm glad you mentioned that honesty and transparency thing. That sort of leads into the next point, right? And I will say something that is embarrassing for me is when our head of security started the first phishing campaign he did, I actually clicked one of the links and got caught and got retrained. And I was like, it can happen to me. And that is both scary, but that honesty is helpful. And so, which is my last point, right, is really being honest and proactive when we're looking at the data. And I say like the data, like some big idea out there. I mean, looking at your own business, looking at, are you seeing a lot of bad activity or potentially fraudulent activity? And also looking at the industry, and being really honest about how do real estate agents, how are they acting and feeling in these situations? How are the consumers acting and feeling? How are we doing as an industry? Not just like, what are we doing, but how do people feel about what we're doing too, right? And I think that leads us into our next area we really wanted to talk about, state of wire fraud, because we feel like that's part of the reason we publish a state of wire fraud report, is to create that honest conversation, to build better trust and build better and operationalize better trust.
Yeah, and so we're very excited to get to dig in. We kind of highlight 5 different points that we want to walk through from the report, and just to sort of like set the stage for this as we go into it. State of wire fraud and the report that we put together is both based on data that we see from our customers and our product and those interactions, as well as a very large consumer survey that we did, where we actually went out to, I think, almost 700 individuals who had recently gone through the home purchasing process and got, honest and direct feedback from them, not as certified. They had no idea who we were or what we were doing. So we wanted to have that honesty in an unbiased manner so that we could take a look in the mirror and say, all right, what is the consumer facing? How are they perceiving the problem? And what then will help us lead to creating better solutions, supporting you all in the market, to make sure that we can continue to make an impact on this problem. So we'll jump right in with fact number 1. So consumers are inadequately aware of the risks. They indicated in our report that 51% of all consumers are not or only somewhat aware of real estate fraud. Max, what's your takeaway here?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is one of those things where I said we needed to be honest. That being honest is sometimes hard. This is a personal analogy. Years ago, I had a friend who I thought I spent lots of time checking up with, that we had a great friendship, that I was being a good steward of that friendship. And at one point he reached out to me and he was like, man, you just like, doesn't feel like you care about me. You don't check in on me very often, and I realized that despite the fact that I thought I was doing a lot, he didn't. And I think like that's the honesty that we need to bring to looking at stuff like this. Is we're doing a lot. I feel like the industry is doing a lot. That doesn't mean that the end users or end consumers feel like we're doing a lot. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily reaching them. And I think that's an important takeaway here, right? Is while we're doing a lot, that is true. And we need to do more, is what I see here.
Yeah, and I think that's a great call out. I mean, I think that when we reviewed this data, we were like, oh, I wish we had this exact question asked the last, 3 years, because I think that there is credit to be had for the industry, that this would have likely been, a lot higher number 2 years ago than it is today. But to your point, this is still a high number, and we just have to be aware of it. And we have to recognize, from the angle of the consumer, that there is more to do. And so I think that honesty and that reflection is really key. And I think that for us, you talked about education a lot, but I think we tried to identify like what could be a call to action effectively for everyone on this call. How could we address each one of these individually? And here, I really do think it's about awareness building. Like you talked about education being such an important layer. And I think that, we just have to keep consistent with those communications and reminding ourselves, like you said, that trust and safety, really is core to what everyone in this industry does, and continue to reinforce it through education internally and education with consumers, and that we believe we can make an impact on this number. But it's going to feel like we're repeating ourselves and repeating ourselves and repeating ourselves. But that's part of the gig.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of that just comes down to, like we said, taking an honest look at like how we're communicating too, and just making sure that we're doing it effectively. I know this, and I'm not going to drag any title companies that I worked on in my own real estate deals, but I remember in one of them where I was buying a house, I got the document that was talking about wire fraud, and it had like bolded. The whole sentence was bolded and it was in red, and then there was like a yellow box, and it was clear to me that they used to just give a document that had the explanation, and then they had to bold it and make the fonts bigger, and then they had to make it red. And it was, I sort of thought to myself, like, well, this sheet just isn't working. This handout isn't working. You can make it as bold as you want. It's still not going to work. We probably just need to reframe where we're talking about it and how, right? And so going back to that whole idea of relationships, like an idea would be like explaining it to the consumer as like how we get through this deal fast and smooth is by like being aware of these things, right? Not that they're just risks out there somewhere that exist.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, let's go on to number 2. So number 2, they need real estate professionals to protect them. So we found in our report that 71% or 2 in 3 consumers believe it's someone else's responsibility to educate them on wire fraud. What do you think about this, Max?
I mean, this goes back to what we said earlier, right? That like the title company or the attorneys, whoever's in the center of that relationship for the entire length of the deal, ultimately you're going to bear the responsibility, whether that's fair or not. You're the one who sees this whole deal across the life cycle, and the consumers especially, they're not going to know this. For some of them, they're going to do this once in their life. And for others, maybe more, but they're just never going to see it as their responsibility, and it's going to defer to the person brokering it. And the real estate agents, as we all know, and that may change over time, they also just don't feel incentivized in many ways to care about this because they're not handling the money, they're not clearing the title, they're not doing any of these essential aspects at the core of it.
Yeah. And I was reading while you were talking, I was reading Kyle's message into the webinar chat. And I think that, talk about an honest reflection, pointing out the fact that they are doing all of this in their operation, and it takes a lot of time. There's a lot more effort and work that needs to be done there, but that they are seeing the benefits of it by buyers feeling more comfortable with the process from the very beginning. And I think you actually showed me this. Max has an ability to break things down in unique ways for the team and like use research and data, but there's like this learning curve with everything. And every time you introduce a new process or something new, like it is going to drag on your own operations and it's going to take time. But as everybody gets more confident in it, you start to see that curve, and I forget what the curve is called, but you start to see that curve, yeah. And then you start to see more efficiencies gained in the team, and then everyone gets it. But getting over that initial hump can be so hard, and to the point where a lot of people will like quit or go back to the old process or do what they were doing. But you just got to remember, you're just in that kind of hard middle part, and once you get through it, hopefully it will become more second nature. And then like Kyle saw in his operation, you'll start to feel the benefits of it, and then the task itself doesn't feel like such a big to do because you feel like you're getting the value from it.
And that kind of scalability is going to separate the good from the great in terms of companies who people want to work with. And that's important to remember too, right? Is like there is incentive to do those things, which is to like become one of those great companies that people want to work with.
Totally. And I think that this kind of call to action on this one around buyers and sellers increasingly choosing their agents based on who provides security. I actually went to Inman Connect recently, and I think there's going to be more and more of this, especially with all the changes in the real estate space around commissions and those sorts of things. Like there's going to be that value component, and I think the real estate agents are going to have to deliver it. But then I think that that's going to have to trickle down and flow in through the title agent experience as well. And consumers clearly, their voice is being heard right now. And I think that if we're not there to position ourselves in the industry from a title perspective to be the industry that is protecting them at every layer, that there is risk inherently to our own kind of ability to provide that, and how buyers and sellers could become a louder voice around, not feeling protected at every stage of the transaction.
Yeah, no, right. I don't want to reveal too much, but I will say just in terms of our own product, we've taken this very seriously in terms of like the essential role that the real estate agents play. And we have thought a lot about how do we actually include them in the process, and not just have a process that only includes the title agency, right? How can we use the relationship with the real estate agent effectively in a way that they would actually be okay with? Because we also know that's tenuous too. And that's just an important aspect of how we're thinking about our own product roadmap.
100%. All right, number 3, the consumer impact is larger than we imagined. When I saw this stat, I went back to our team and said, oh, wait, we got to look at this one more time. How did we ask the question? Is there any chance this didn't get answered incorrectly? Like, we were also very, wowed by this in some way, but what it came out. So the question was simple. It said, did you receive any suspicious or fraudulent communications during your closing process? And 1 in 20 responded yes, that they became victims of fraud during the closing process. To put it in comparison, I believe in the report, we might have even mentioned that it's closer to like, 1 in 200 that end up in a car accident. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's where it was in terms of a comparison. So just to kind of frame that up on an annual basis, this is a lot of people that are getting targeted. And we've known for a while that this industry is getting targeted way more than most. But this made it abundantly clear that we really do need to lean in here. So Max, I don't know if you had other points to make on this one.
I think this, as well as there's a slide, I think after this one, that it just goes to prove the point that, the reason we harden trust, the reason we need to educate, the reason we need to do all of this is way more common than it has ever been, and it will become more common. Organized crime and fraud groups have fundraised effectively for the last 5 years, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars, I believe, through payoff protect fraud, or not payoff protect fraud, through payroll, what was it? Payroll protection,
PPP,
PPP loans, through unemployment, through real estate, through other stuff. They have effectively out fundraised all of security and fraud prevention technology in some ways. And so they are going to scale what they're doing. And does that mean that they're going to, defraud like every single one of these people? No, but they're going to definitely send them emails and text messages and get, PDFs of payoffs injected, and they're just going to try everything they can. And so we need to pay close attention to those signals.
Yeah. And that just reinforces that, like, the probability of being hit with wire fraud is more than, anybody is insured for, and more than we sort of have ever imagined it is today. All right. Point number 4, a more secure future is possible with action. So we're including some stats here. I think it's important for you to help clarify these a little bit from the seat that you sit in. But, we said certified customers identified and prevented $2.4 billion in suspected fraud in 2023. Can you just help kind of like explain that to the audience?
Yeah. I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole, so I'll try and keep it high level, but still succinct. We say suspected fraud because when fraud hasn't occurred, it's actually really hard to call it fraud. We just see, like we said, those signals of suspicious activity, whether that's like emails coming from different people, different sources, international traffic across our system when the individuals are doing an entirely US based deal and everybody's located in the US, other signals and things. So these are what I would call, right, like our yellow lights. And so it's like $2.4 billion where there were yellow lights and red lights. The reason that that's important is you're like, wow, 2.4 billion, that sounds like a whole lot. Well, there's trillions of dollars in real estate deals every year. This is not that big. This is still a pretty small amount. It's significant, but it's a pretty high fidelity signal, right? That we need to slow down in these situations because these dollars are at risk. There are lots of billions of other dollars that we green-lighted, that we said, great, go full speed, go ahead, high trust situation. But the reason we call this out is just it's growing year over year for sure. And these are the situations where we need to slow down.
Totally agree. In addition to slowing down, it's all about like that layered approach, right? And so that is, I appreciate you just overview of that, because I do think it's important. The yellow light, red light, I think really helps a lot for a lot of folks, because I think that that'll hopefully let them understand, where it's at. All right. And then point number 5. So we indicated that, there's power in the community. Can you just kind of describe this and what we mean by this when we think about Payoff Protect and sort of its success last year in terms of how we've been able to support the industry?
Yeah, so we have adopted in the last few years here at CertifID, we have adopted a new strategy of trying to use what's called the network effect as much as possible. And the network effect means that the more businesses, individuals that are inside of our network, and we're sharing that data internally to check against each other, we can better stop fraud, we can better prevent fraud, and we can better create speed. Payoff Protect is built around this idea, that product. And so the idea there around the way it instant validates or flags as high risk or has a manual validation route is that we're actually using the aggregate of all the payoffs across our system to be able to create, better trust and be able to catch fraud and catch fraudulent accounts. And the point there is just that product individually, but I think also as an industry, we need to be open to and realize being honest and sharing information will create a better security and fraud prevention place to stand for all of us. And so I know that's really hard for folks. I talked to some folks at our conference at Livewire where they were saying, they've tried to talk to other title companies in their market, and none of them want to talk about whether or not they experience fraud or what those fraudulent accounts might have been or where those emails were or which real estate agent they were dealing with. But those are important pieces of information and data, and that's stuff we're building towards in the future. But I would hope, even just as an industry, we can get to the point where we share more of that information so that you can know, like, hey, we could stop more fraud if we just are really honest about it.
Yeah. And I mean, just to put it in live context, I mean, our fraud recovery services hotline gets called now almost 5 times a day, I'd say. And every time that we find fraudulent information from that or from something that we catch in the product, we ingest that data and then we leverage it. And we had an instance over the holidays, and then it's kind of trickled into still today, where a fraud crime group is trying to leverage a handful of accounts at some regional banks that we've actually had a really hard time getting the regional banks to shut down. And so it came in as a fraud recovery services hotline call. We ingest that data. We have now stopped over $4 million in fraud for our customers instantly because they put in the same data, they put in the same wiring instructions via either a payoff on payoff protect. And then we were able to say, no, this is fraudulent. Like, we know that account is being utilized fraudulently. So it's the power of the network. But I totally agree with you, Max. I think that, like, that broader conversation is really, really important because that sort of conversation is where I think there's even more to be gained from members of the community in terms of the way that they can talk, and not only about like bad experiences that they had, but also like what's working. Like, let's talk about those strategies too, and let's share them because they shouldn't be secrets. So we definitely feel like, the more that we're able to support you in our business, and our goal is obviously to continue to protect this industry from fraud, and hopefully as we scale, that the power of that network continues to grow. We do have a couple of questions. I'm going to flip to here. So as mentioned, the State of Wire Fraud report is now live. We've got a link to it here. Also, this fun QR code for those of you who want to pull it up, but would love for you to check it out. Max, there was a question that came up that I wanted to answer. So Mary asks, are there any particular parties specifically targeted more often, buyers or sellers?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, I don't think there is anyone particularly targeted more often. That's a hard question to answer. I would say every part of the deal is getting more attacks more than it ever has been before. And we see this in a variety of different strategies. And there's probably some new strategies that are getting cooked up right now by crime rings too. So I would say buyers, I don't think the attack on them will ever go away. It's going to be really hard to prevent, because the first way that they attack buyers is if they figure out someone's in a real estate deal, either through compromising a real estate agent or through just looking at Zillow or, open source information and intelligence, they'll just email buyers wiring information, and it's surprisingly effective. And that's why that upfront conversation with everyone in the deal is really important, because educating them that you're not going to email them wiring information, that will continue, I think, to be a problem. It's a very hard problem to solve. On the seller side, there's definitely a few different active strategies there. The traditional one of just, trying to get the title agent or the real estate agent to send email to a compromised email or to something that a fraudster owns or a phone number, but also, like we were saying on the vacant lot, just impersonation of a seller themselves, like a person who doesn't even exist as a property owner for a vacant lot or for other properties. The payoff ones have become very big. We're catching more and more of those. Those are in the beginning of this year. I think we're going to be sharing some of those stats at some point. We have seen that explode. We are seeing, fraudulent PDFs getting injected all over the place in deals at every aspect of it. So I don't think any of it's really going to slow down. And I think, like I said, they're going to find new ways too. That's why we try to really stay ahead of it and really look for how can we make, going back to my red light, green light stuff, how do we like really make red lights for our customers and our products, but also be open to the fact that we need to signal some things as yellow lights because it's just an emerging strategy that isn't even well understood yet.
Yeah, that's a great call out. We got another question here. It says, any recommendations on solutions for identifying sellers that don't come into the office?
We are going to be releasing an IDV solution, a full identity verification solution that does identification credentials, documents, as well as like selfies and stuff like that we're going to be releasing in a little bit at the end of this quarter, I believe. We also, our own confirm requests can be used in this way. Confirm and collect can be used in this way. Just for when you want to collect the information, if you just want to do it at the very beginning, it's a great way to try and identify, the sort of potential fraud for a given seller. Those are the ways I would recommend. I think part of the reason we're really spinning up our own IDV solution, we always wanted to, it's a part of making sure we can really protect the whole deal. Also, the other solutions around IDV out there are really either hard to use or don't get as nuanced as we feel like it should be to really detect variances and behavior and other stuff.
Well, one thing too that you had always said, and I know we're almost out of time, but I think be wary as well of like only using an ID card validation. Yeah. Like that is truly just a document that you're verifying. And I think we always wanted to develop what we have as our true like identity verification, which is looking at device analysis, looking at a lot of different markers for potential fraud, and then adding on sort of the document verification, so to speak. So just be careful of that in market right now, especially. There's a lot of, identity card verification, but that to us is like only one very small layer. And if you don't have the other layers, there's actually a lot of holes in that strategy. So just be careful there. And it's one of the reasons why we were releasing it kind of after the foundation that we've set from an identity verification perspective. I just think that's an important nuance because I think that there's a lot of misconceptions right now around how and what, an ID card verification process can do to eliminate, risk.
Yeah, 100%. I think Dennis asked a question here as well. Has Ron increased the risk of fraud? I'm remiss to blame Ron for the increase of fraud there. I will say, doing remote closings, non in person, not in office, is something that would have happened at some point, and it was just accelerated by the pandemic, and then some legislation, that allowed sort of remote closings. Did it increase fraud? Yes, but it wasn't because remote closings themselves are like more fraudulent. It's because we didn't, as a whole industry, I think, approach it saying, what do we need to change in order to do these and keep the level of trust that we had? We just went headfirst into them and said, we'll just treat this like an in-office closing, and in many ways. And so I think that's a great question, because I think anytime we adopt new technology, new solutions, or the industry itself changes the topography of it, we have to really ask those fundamental critical questions. Like, what are the assumptions we're making here that we need to question and change?
Valerie asking the question that, typically everybody wants to ask the VP of product about the roadmap. So I think the question is, when will the, identity verification solution be available? I told Max we weren't going to put him on the line of giving up any dates for anything, but you want to answer this one?
Yeah, we have a beta group we're going to be launching in March, because I think Tyler said this early on. I won't go on too long. I really think that solving a problem like this more comprehensively and really creating a solution that people can adopt and use and put into their workflows is really important. So we're launching it with a beta group to just ensure that we're building the right thing that solves this the right way. And then we'll have a larger release after that. I would say early Q2. Although, like I said, confirm and collect can also be used in similar ways right now. Feel free to reach out to CSM, or if you're a prospect or a person who's interested, our sales team is very well equipped to talk to that.
And if you want to be part of the beta, shoot me an email or shoot Max an email or your CSM, raise your hand. We'd love to be able to prioritize you for that if that's something that's interesting to you. All right. Well, Max, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. Hopefully the audience enjoyed it as well. And thank you all for joining us for another installment of To Catch a Fraudster. Hope you have a great rest.
Thanks, everyone.